I want to show you what these verses in 1 Peter chapter 4 are all about. Let's remember where we're at in the book as a whole. I think that we are in the middle of a section here that started all the way back in chapter 3, verse 8, and extends through 4:11, where Peter is addressing all of you, finally, all of you. He's addressed citizens and slaves and masters and husbands and wives, and then all Christians. And I think the point that Peter has been trying to make is this. As a Christian, how do you live in a world that sometimes persecutes Christians? How do you live in a world where sometimes Christians suffer? And what he keeps doing is he keeps pointing us to Christ. He keeps saying, this is how Jesus acted when he was persecuted. So imitate him. And so you saw that in chapter 3, verse 18, for Christ also suffered once for sins. And then in the start of our chapter today in verse 4, it again point back to Christ, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh. And so over and over, what Peter is doing is he's saying, Christians, as you suffer persecution, look to Christ. This text today, we're going to divide really into 3 sections here, and that'll just help us to talk about it. First section here, then second section here, then the third section here. Let's look at the first section together. Peter says this, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. It's interesting. Jesus was persecuted. Christians, you're going to be persecuted. So arm yourself. Now, Peter's not going to say arm yourself with a sword. If you've read the Gospels, you know Peter's history with arming himself with a sword. Peter says something different. Arm yourselves with a way of thinking. In other words, a way of thinking will arm yourself, will prepare you for persecution. What way of thinking? The same way of thinking. The same way of thinking that Christ had when he suffered. Well, how did Jesus think when he was being persecuted? Well, I think we see that back in chapter 2. Chapter 2 in verse 23 says this, and it describes how Jesus acted when he was persecuted. When he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. He kept entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. And then in chapter 3, we saw kind of the same idea. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. And so, do you see how Peter keeps going back to this idea? Christians, yes, you suffer persecution, but arm yourselves with the same kind of thinking that Jesus had. It really matters the way that you think. Then Peter says this, for whoever has suffered in the flesh, notice the similarity, Christ suffered in the flesh. Whoever among us Christians have suffered in the flesh have ceased from sin. What does that mean? Is Peter saying that Christians stop sinning altogether? A disciple is someone who never sins again? I don't think that's quite right. Peter himself was a disciple of Jesus, and he denied Christ 3 times. And so I don't think that's the idea. But what is true is that a Christian is someone who has broken free from the life of sin. They're no longer characterized by someone who lives a life of sin. Instead, they live a pure life, a holy life. They're not living a sinful life. I think that's the idea here. Peter says this is how a Christian lives. So as to live for the rest of time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but to live for the will of God. And this is what it means to cease from sin. You're a Christian now. You don't live a life of sin. You don't live the rest of your time on earth, the rest of your time in the flesh, chasing human passions, but chasing the will of God. Peter says this next in verse 3. He's basically saying, you've had enough time to follow the passions of sin. He says, for the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do. And here's what the Gentiles want to do. Here's how the Gentiles live. They live in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. Christians, we've ceased from sin. We are now chasing after the will of God. we're not going to live our lives doing what the Gentiles do any longer. Let's talk about this word, the word sensuality. It means to throw off restraint, to cast off restraint. Do you know, the thing that's really fun about sin is doing what's forbidden. That's a big part of what makes sin so fun. It's really fun to do what's forbidden. And sensuality, it's often connected, it's often in lists of sins in the New Testament that are connected to sexual sins, immorality, sensuality. So often it has to do with indulging in the forbidden, getting a thrill out of casting off restraint. That's the idea. And so Christians, we're not to live like that anymore. We're to no longer, as we think about sexual boundaries, as we think about how we live, even what you wear, you're not to just enjoy casting off restraint. And we're not to chase these things anymore as a Christian. We've had enough time for that. Now, what happens when you as a Christian live a life that is no longer walking in sin, but walking in righteousness? Well, the world doesn't like that very much. Notice what Peter says this, with respect to this, they are surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery. Boy, that sure happens. Someone comes to faith in Christ, they say, I'm no longer going to live a life of sin. And what do their friends do? They're surprised, they're shocked at this. Who do you think you are? Are you better than us? Is kind of the idea that happens. And so what happens? Well, they start maligning you. They start maligning you. And this is so often what happens when someone comes to faith in Christ. Well, what Peter says, he wants to give encouragement to Christians who are being maligned. And so I think he offers two lines of encouragement for Christians who are being maligned. And we see those in verses 5 and 6. So I'll kind of label these A and B. Two things that should encourage a Christian who's being maligned. First thing is this. But they, that is those who malign you, they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Christian, if you're being maligned because you left the life of sin and you're following Jesus, take heart because you're on the right side. Those who malign you are on the wrong side. And they're going to have to give an account to God who's ready to judge. So that's the first reason to be encouraged. But the second reason to be encouraged, Christian, is that even though you are being maligned, you will rise again. And even if they kill you, even if you're maligned to the point of death, you will spend eternity with God in heaven. You will live. I think that's the next line of encouragement that Peter offers. It's a little confusing, though, so hang with me as we interpret this together. Peter says, "For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead." And that raises a question. Okay, how is the gospel preached to those who are dead? Some might interpret this to say that this is talking about people who have died and gone to hell, and then maybe Jesus, after he died on the cross, went and preached to them the gospel and rescued them. But I think that's really an idea that's quite foreign to the New Testament. I think that's forcing an idea in here. I think there's a much more natural way of understanding this. Who are those who are dead? I think this is talking about Christians who have died. Christians who have died. In other words, the gospel was preached even to Christians who are now dead. John Piper was helpful as I was interpreting this. Christians who are now dead. In other words, this is talking about people who heard the gospel preached, they believed, but then they died, perhaps by means of persecution. And so maybe a good example to help us think this through is the example of Stephen. Let's think about Stephen. Remember him, the gospel was preached to him. He believed the gospel, but then he was persecuted and maligned and judged, and they stoned him. And so now he is dead. Well, what hope is there for someone like Stephen? He was maligned. He believed in Christ. The gospel was preached. He believed in Christ. He's maligned. He's persecuted. Well, here's the hope. Even though he's judged in the flesh by those who who persecuted him, even though that happened to him, they are alive. They might live in the Spirit the same way God does. So even though someone like Stephen was maligned and judged and even killed, where is he now? He's with God in heaven. So I think that's the idea here that Peter is saying. Take heart, Christian. And Christians, we're to keep in mind, we're not to live like the Gentiles because the end of all things is at hand. The judge is ready. So be self-controlled, be sober-minded for the sake of your prayers. Perhaps this is a reference back to chapter 3, where Peter was addressing husbands, and he says that husbands should live with their wives in an understanding way so that their prayers may not be hindered. Perhaps there's a similar idea going on here. Christians, remember that the judge is ready. So live self-controlled and sober-minded so that your prayers aren't hindered for the sake of your prayers. Okay, now let's briefly talk about these verses 8 through 11. Peter, I think, is kind of landing the plane here. He's ending his section, and he gives 5 rapid-fire instructions. Let's look at them briefly. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. That's number 1. Number 2, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Then number 3 is this: as each has received a gift from God, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Number 4 here, whoever speaks as one who speaks the oracles of God. Perhaps the idea is talking of someone who's preaching. You're speaking the very oracles of God. Keep that in mind. And then last here is 5th, whoever serves should serve as one who serves by the strength that God supplies. And the end of all of this is that God is glorified. And so you get kind of these rapid fire commands. Christians, the end of all things is coming. So don't live as the Gentiles do. The time has passed for all of that. Instead, here's how you are to live. And so I think what we find in the second half of chapter 3 through the first half of chapter 4 is this encouragement to Christians. Christians, this is how you are to live when you are being persecuted. All right, that's a lot, but I think that gives a window into what this text is all about. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.